Welcome back. Today, I want to talk about a question that comes up constantly in nutrition and fitness. As we get older, do we need animal protein to maintain muscle, or can plant protein work just as well? We often hear that whey protein is superior because it contains more essential amino acids, particularly leucine, and is generally more digestible than many plant proteins. And physiologically, that argument makes sense. But does that difference actually translate into more muscle protein being synthesized over several days of normal eating and exercise? A recent randomized controlled trial published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition tried to answer exactly that question. The study included adults between 50 and 70 years of age and compared a predominantly animal protein diet supplemented with whey protein against a predominantly plant protein diet supplemented with pea protein, and the findings are quite interesting. First, why is this question important? As we age, maintaining skeletal muscle becomes increasingly difficult. One reason is something called anabolic resistance. Normally, when we eat protein or perform resistance exercise, muscle protein synthesis increases. But with advancing age, skeletal muscle may become less responsive to these anabolic stimuli. That means an older person may need a stronger nutritional or exercise stimulus to produce the same muscle building response seen in a younger adult. Because of this, researchers have spent a lot of time studying not only how much protein older adults should eat, but also what type of protein they should eat. Animal proteins such as whey generally contain a greater proportion of essential amino acids and are highly digestible. Plant proteins can contain lower concentrations of certain essential amino acids and may have lower digestibility. So, based purely on protein quality, you might predict that whey would stimulate more muscle protein synthesis than pea protein. That was essentially the hypothesis of this study. But there is an important difference between this study and many previous studies. A lot of protein research measures muscle protein synthesis for only a few hours after somebody drinks a protein shake. That tells us about the acute response. This study wanted to look at something closer to real life. The researchers studied 27 adults between 50 and 70 years old for 10 days. One group consumed an animal-focused diet supplemented with whey protein. The other consumed a plant-focused diet supplemented with pea protein. Importantly, total protein intake was kept very similar between the groups, approximately 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight per day. The diets were intentionally very different in where the protein came from. In the animal-focused group, approximately 75% of dietary protein came from animal sources and 25% from plant sources. In the plant-focused group, that ratio was essentially reversed, approximately 25% animal and 75% plant protein. So this was not simply whey versus pea in isolation. The researchers were trying to create two realistic dietary patterns with substantially different protein sources. There was another clever part of the experiment. Each participant trained only one leg. They performed supervised knee extension resistance exercise every other day during the 10-day intervention. The other leg remained untrained. That meant every participant essentially provided their own control. One leg showed what happened with diet alone. The other showed what happened when that same diet was combined with resistance exercise. And this is where the study becomes especially interesting from a metabolism perspective. Instead of measuring muscle protein synthesis for just 3 or 4 hours after a meal, the researchers used deuterated water, D2O, to measure integrated myofibrillar protein synthesis across the intervention. Participants consumed D2O, which enriched the body water pool with deuterium. Over time, that deuterium becomes incorporated into amino acids such as alanine and ultimately into newly synthesized muscle proteins. By taking muscle biopsies and measuring deuterium incorporation into muscle protein, the researchers could estimate how much new myofibrillar protein had been synthesized over several days. So rather than asking, What happened to muscle protein synthesis for 3 hours after a protein shake? They were essentially asking, over many days of normal meals, daily living, sleep, and exercise, how much muscle protein was actually being synthesized. That distinction is very important. The study used body water enrichment as the precursor and protein bound deuterated alanine as the product to calculate fractional synthesis rate. So, what happened? First, resistance training clearly worked. In the animal focused whey group, daily integrated myofibrillar protein synthesis was approximately 1.44% per day in the trained leg, compared with 1.29% per day in the untrained leg. In the plant-focused P group, it was approximately 1.50% per day in the trained leg, compared with 1.34% per day in the untrained leg. The effect of training was highly significant, but when the researchers compared the animal-focused diet with the plant-focused diet, there was no significant difference in muscle protein synthesis. The trained legs responded similarly, and the untrained legs responded similarly. The statistical analysis showed a clear training effect, but no protein source effect and no interaction between protein source and training. That is probably the most important result of the entire study. Resistance exercise mattered more than whether most of the dietary protein came from animal or plant sources. Now, this does not mean that whey and pea protein are nutritionally identical. They were not. In fact, the whey supplement provided substantially more essential amino acids. The researchers reported that essential amino acid provision from whey was about 37% greater than from pea protein. Yet, despite that difference, integrated muscle protein synthesis over the 10-day period was essentially the same. Why? One possibility proposed by the researchers is that the pea protein still provided enough essential amino acids to cross the threshold necessary to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And remember, people were not consuming pea protein by itself in a laboratory. They were eating mixed meals. Different foods eaten together can complement one another's amino acid profiles. So, although isolated proteins differ in amino acid composition, those differences may become less important when proteins are consumed as part of a varied diet. The researchers also point out that pea protein isolate itself is a relatively high quality plant protein compared with many less refined plant protein sources. There is another very important point. This was only a 10-day study. 10 days is enough to detect changes in integrated muscle protein synthesis, but it is not long enough to expect major changes in muscle size or strength. And that is exactly what they found. There were no meaningful changes in muscle architecture or strength between the dietary groups. There were also no major differences in metabolic rate, renal function markers, or whole body nitrogen balance. One interesting secondary observation was that non-HDL cholesterol decreased in the plant-focused group, but this was not the primary outcome of the study. So, what should we take away from this? Not that protein quality is irrelevant, and certainly not that all plant proteins and animal proteins are equivalent. This particular experiment compared whey and pea supplementation within carefully controlled mixed diets with total protein intake around 1 gram per kilogram per day. The result should therefore not be interpreted as saying that every plant-based diet automatically provides adequate protein. Protein quantity, essential amino acid intake, digestibility, and overall dietary composition still matter. But within the conditions of this study, changing the predominant source of protein did not meaningfully change integrated muscle protein synthesis. Exercise did. And I think that is the practical message for someone in their 50s, 60s, or beyond who is worried about preserving muscle. Arguing endlessly about whether whey is better than pea protein may be missing the larger point. First, make sure you are eating sufficient protein. Make sure your diet supplies adequate essential amino acids. And most importantly, Give your muscle a reason to use that protein. Resistance exercise provides that signal. In this experiment, training one leg was enough to produce a clear increase in muscle protein synthesis compared with the person's own untrained leg, regardless of whether the diet was predominantly animal or plant focused. So perhaps the question should not simply be, which protein is best? A better question may be, am I eating enough high quality protein overall? And am I consistently doing resistance exercise? Because based on this study for muscle protein synthesis in middle to older age, the resistance exercise stimulus was more important than the predominant source of dietary protein. And that is probably a much more useful message than declaring either plant protein or animal protein the winner. Thanks for listening. Educational disclaimer. This episode discusses findings from a scientific study for educational purposes only. It is not individualized medical or nutritional advice and is not intended to promote any specific protein product, supplement, or brand.